Welcome, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. I suspect more people will be coming in the next few minutes, but I want for us to get started. Thank you for joining for this conversation. I'm very excited about what Diane will share with us this afternoon. I want to just start by saying that Professor Diane Winston and her husband Chris were early members of IKAR and really a part of building that early foundation for our community. And it's a great joy to be in community with you. And I'm so thrilled that we get to talk about this work. Let me give you a little bit of how shall we refer to you, Professor Winston? I should have asked you before.
Diane.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll do that. So I will. It's interesting. We have this amazing community, and there's so many brilliant people in it, and we sometimes we know each other by where we sit on Shabbos morning, and not by their incredible scholarship and work outside of shul. And so I'm thrilled that we get to see and hear from you. Now, Diane Winston is a national authority on religion and the media as both a journalist and a scholar. Her expertise includes religion, politics, and the news media. And she is a Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist, author, and columnist. She has authored and edited numerous books on the connection between religion, media, American history, and politics. And there's a list. I mean, having just put out a book, I am astonished and humbled by the number of books that you have written and how extraordinary your work is in this one, which gives me a hint or a taste of what we can find in the rest of them. The latest book, the one that we're going to be talking about today, is called Writing the American Dream, How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. It came out just last year. And it reveals how the Reagan presidency utilized the news media to spread a new religious vision of American identity, one which continues to influence politics to this day, including in the rise of Trumpism and Christian nationalism. It's interesting because we talked about doing this talk back in the spring, and then there was an idea that maybe closer to the election might be wiser because these issues are really going to be at the forefront of our hearts and minds. Now, reading this in the run-up to the 2024 election, it's really fascinating to get from you, I think, a framework to help us understand what's actually going on in these socio-political dynamics that we're encountering. How did we get here, and what are we supposed to do about this? So, Diane, welcome, and thank you. And I wonder if we could just start with you telling us a little bit about why you wanted to write this book and what's your thesis? What's the big argument that you're putting forward here?
I started this book in 2008, almost as long ago as I came to IKAR. And at that point, as you all remember, Obama had been elected, and I thought that we were going to have another sort of cultural, social revolution because of the new spirit he was going to bring to us in America. Obviously, that didn't happen, and so the book took a turn when Trump was elected, and I began thinking, what in our religious lives, what in our political lives, what in our news media led us to this moment where Trump could come to power and where his vision would be so much more powerful than anything Obama could have done. So that was the reason the book came out the way it did.
So it's interesting, right after it was either right after the 2016 election or after he secured the nomination for the Republican Party, I was out with a friend who was ahead of one of the studios here in LA. And she said, I feel like this is my fault because I put the first reality TV show on the air. And I feel like we in the entertainment industry created a hunger for humiliation, for human cruelty, for like you watch those shows so that you can see people get embarrassed and shamed and see people speak the truth and are you going to stay or are you going to leave? And so she was taking stock and I think that surely reality TV plays some role, but there are so many other factors that led to this kind of national hunger for that voice. So tell us what you found when you went back to 1983, and which is where your story literally begins, even though even that is a reaction to what came before it. So can you tell us what you found?
Well, it began with Morning in America, and it began with Reagan. And those of you in the room who are old enough to remember Reagan, remember that he came to power right after Carter. And people were so disillusioned with Carter and all his mistakes, and Reagan promised he would make America great again. What he didn't tell us was he was going to do that by changing the way we thought about who we were, where we were living, and what our duty was as citizens. I hate to use this word because it's overused, but Reagan had a market-driven neoliberal vision of what society should be. And basically, if you can remember back to the 80s, there were no reality shows, so I'm glad they're taking some responsibility. But there also wasn't the great inequity in terms of pay between CEOs and workers. There weren't as many things to buy. There weren't 1,000,001 cosmetics being marketed to women. There weren't 1,000,001 opportunities to spend money and to think that money was going to actually make you happy. There were other things going on in society that gave people hope and vision. And as a matter of fact, I think Reagan's popularity was due in large part because he gave people a vision. He gave them hope for a better future. And as the great philosopher Michael Walzer has said, without a vision, the people die. And after the 60s and 70s, a lot of Americans were disillusioned. They wanted something to believe in. There had been terrible recession. People were out of jobs. There had been the feminist revolution. There was identity politics. And people were tired and they were looking for something. And Reagan gave them something. Unfortunately, from my perspective, what he gave them was a vision that by making money, by thinking about yourself, by putting yourself first, by limiting government, by not taking care of other people, not caring about your community, all these things, which were part of his market-driven neoliberal perspective, would make for a better America.
There's so many foundational pieces here that I want to ask you about, but since we're starting in the early 80s, and we'll talk about the American dream and the imaginary, but I want to. You wrote something here that says it so well. You said, in 1980, when voters were asked to choose between Carter's call for sober self-reflection on national limits and Reagan's summons, let's make America great again, their preference was clear. This is so chilling, Diane. I mean, really, it feels like we want America to do a reckoning. I want America to engage in sober self-reflection. I feel that is essential for a community, for a national body, for us as global citizens. People don't want that. They don't want to vote for that. And it seems like it kind of helped me understand a little bit about that kind of intoxicating language that Trump uses that so many people are drawn to, and so many others are like, how could that possibly speak to you? What we need is exactly the opposite. And I wonder if you feel that either 2016, 2020, or 2024, we're really just repeating that choice for the voters between Carter and the Democratic ticket, essentially saying, like, America can do better, but only if we do the hard work of getting there. Reckoning and reparation, changing establishing a truly equitable social policy. What's the same and what's different now, and how scared should we be?
What I neglected to say was that the reason, no one likes to think they're being selfish, right? So the reason Reagan could sell this policy was because he coded it in evangelical politics. And it does make sense because evangelicalism is all about the individual's personal relationship to God. So it does foster a sense of responsibility, but also putting yourself first. And so that's how Reagan could sell this agenda. And evangelicals or conservative religious people also do believe in limited government, except when it comes to women's bodies and people's marital choices and things like that. And they also believe in free markets. They're very much believers in individual rights. What's different today is that Reagan, I don't think, could have foreseen how toxic his policies would become. I basically believe that Reagan was a decent person, and I believe he was a Christian, which obviously Trump is not. I just don't think he understood what would happen in the future. So, and I do think Reagan really wanted America to be great again in his vision. Trump doesn't care about America being great. He cares about himself being great. And he has taken these policies to a place that is ridiculous. It's not even consistent. Whereas Reagan wanted a strong America to be strong in the world, you know, Trump doesn't care about international policy. Where Trump really believed in limited government, you know, where Reagan believed in limited government, you know, Trump wants government to do what he wants it to do. He's not a political person. He doesn't have an agenda. So the problem today in 2016, 2020 was that the Republican Party is being led by someone who has no philosophical depth, no political affiliation, and no principles. And he uses religion as a way to bring people closer to him, but there's nothing at all religious about him. So insofar as someone unprincipled and self-absorbed and narcissistic, and I could keep going on with all the adjectives to describe Trump, is the standard bearer for one of our major parties. We're in much worse shape than we were in 1980 when, I'm not defending Reagan, he did a lot of bad things, but he at least was committed to a conservative vision that had some coherence.
It's interesting, you write about how not only has politics changed, but religion has changed, Christianity has changed, and there was this moment, I found this very interesting, where essentially Jesus was reimagined from being, you know, a person for the people to being this kind of successful businessman. And so therefore Christians could model themselves after Jesus and not feel bad about being extremely wealthy and about voting for social policy that could be very damaging to the poor. And I think that which started in the 80s has only continued. And so that's part of what's so surprising right now. And it's born also, it helped birth the progressive faith communities too, who say things like, that's not what Jesus is. I know what that is. Or, you know, in our Jewish context, where obviously politically it's quite different from the way that Christians have engaged American politics. But even here, you know, one of the great heartaches for me is when I see people who identify as religious who are voting for social policies that are the most harmful to the most vulnerable. And I remember after the 2016 election, we found from the exit polls that one could predict a person's vote based on the number of times that they went to church or synagogue in the course of a week. Almost across the board, obviously, with the exception of this one community, the IKAR community. No, so, but no, I mean, no, not entirely, but like there was a very strong connection between the likelihood that you go weekly to church and the likelihood that you voted for Trump. And so I've really wrestled with that question of why have our religious communities and faith leaders failed to establish a connection between religiosity and kind of humility before God and the need to build a social reality that actually reflects those greatest aspirations. And I feel like you're research is right at the heart of that question. So maybe you can reflect for us a little bit of what you think is behind this conundrum.
Well, it's what I was suggesting before. The Protestant Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, basically was an attempt to wrestle the church back from the Catholic papal hierarchy to the people. And so instead of having a pope mediating between you and God, everyone read the Bible and interpreted it for themselves. This was a whole new way to look at the individual and to give the individual agency and authority. And I believe that that religious revolution that occurred, in the 16th century, affected the way people understood their place in the world and understood their own autonomy. And if that is your basic religious belief, that you are in conversation with God and God is blessing you once you've been saved, you can believe that your vision is central to the way the world is and to how you construct the world. And that's very different than a communitarian vision, which a lot of religions, like I think Judaism in particular, has, where you see, I am an individual, but I am part of a larger community. So I think that by the time we get to the 20th century, the idea of the individual, which is furthered by the whole American democracy and the idea that each individual has a vote, has become even stronger. And many conservatives were appalled by the communist revolution of 1916, and they began thinking that in order to oppose this evil system, which had no religion, no capitalism, and no democracy, that Christianity would be the bulwark against it. And I think that sense empowered Reagan and people in the religious right to believe that the kind of politics where individuals could make their own decisions and they would be strengthened by that rather than thinking communally and collectively was part of the problem.
So you're bringing us right to the religious imaginary, and I wonder if you can share with us what you mean by religious imaginary and how it functioned for Reagan and how it might function differently for people like us, for example, or in other social movements. So
Look, America was the first country that didn't have a divine leader, right? That's one of the things the founding fathers wanted. They wanted a country that was secular, where all religions could flourish and where there was not a main religion in charge. That's hard for people. People want to believe there's some justification for behaving the way they do, for the laws they make, for the political stances they take domestically and internationally. And so I would argue we've always had a soft Protestantism like woven into our country, which, we had blue laws on Sundays. We had, for a long time, schools taught with Christian primers in the 19th century. So we've always had this sort of Protestant, individual, tolerant sense of as we were Americans. I think that the religious imaginary basically is the belief, the ideas, the images that we understand that make us a country. And I think a lot of them are based around this idea that we are free people, we are an exceptional people, we are God-blessed people, and that we are sitting on a hill. And this religious imaginary can coexist with Martin Luther King's beloved community. It can coexist with the Jewish idea of the Golden Land. It can coexist with other religious imaginaries, but this is kind of what I call the uber religious imaginary. And it's not even like you get up in the morning and think, oh God, I'm part of an exceptional nation, I'm a city on a hill. But you do feel like, gee, I'm living in the best country in the world, I'm so lucky to be an American. And I think that's very common to us. in some eras, that religious imaginary, and I'm thinking right now of FDR, and the New Deal, has swung to the communitarian side. And so there's a belief that, gee, I live in exceptional land and we look after each other, isn't that great? That died in the 70s. Reagan comes along and says, yes, we live in an exceptional land and you are free and you can do whatever the heck you want and you are responsible for yourself, and that's that. And Reagan cut taxes. He cut taxes because he himself, when he was doing well in Hollywood, was at the top bracket, which was 90%, and he didn't like that. So he wanted to reduce taxes so he'd have more money in his pocket. But he also reduced taxes because he hated welfare, and he wanted people to get off welfare. And he hated welfare because he thought people should be responsible for themselves. He didn't want them, waiting for a government dole. He wanted them to take care of their families, and he wanted them to take care of themselves. And that is that reason, which for him was a religious reason, the individual responsibility that God gave everyone was as important to him as improving his tax bill. And I think that's what people don't get, that this imaginary was not just a religious thing, it's something that helps you think about your orientation to your friends in your community. What we need now is what you've been talking about in your book, in your sermons, and maybe we're hearing Kamala talk a little about it. It's an idea that would take us back to a more communal sense, to the sense that we're all in it together, and that it's not just about me and my tax bill and my kid, but I also care about what happens to you, and I also care what happens to people in Gaza and what happens to the hostages, and I want to do something about it. And that's something that we've gone very far away from, and I think Trump is the best negative example of where the old religious imaginary leaves us, and you're a good example of the new one.
It's what you're saying is making me think of Arlie Hochschild, and who's one of your colleagues. And so lots of people read J.D. Vance's book right after the 2016 election, and I read Arlie Hochschild's book immediately after. She was, I think, correct me if I'm getting any of these details wrong, but a professor, I think in Berkeley or somewhere in Northern California, who wanted to go to the reddest of red states and just sit and talk to people and try to understand what could possibly be driving them. And her goal was to uncover the narrative that was at the heart of the Trump voter. This was even pre-election, obviously, because I read the book right after, but that idea had already been, that kind of like conservatism was already deeply enmeshed in the political landscape. And even more so once Obama was elected. And so she went into this community in Louisiana. How many folks have read this? It's a couple people, yeah. So please tell me if I'm missing a detail here. But I know that she went into this community that was on what they called, I think, Cancer Alley, which was this waterway that some multinational corporation was dumping sludge into, and every single household that lived on this waterway had somebody who either died from cancer or was dying from cancer, but they hated the EPA, they hated Obama, they wanted him out, and they wanted the EPA to be disbanded. So she's trying to understand why, because it's totally counter to their own self-interest and also to reason. And what she came up with was this narrative that these voters and these Americans tell a story in which America is this giant mountain or hill, and we're all online climbing up the mountain, and if you're lucky, every generation or so you get to take another step up. Everyone wants to get to the top, but then all of a sudden this man jumped the line. He skipped the line. He got into Columbia, he got into Harvard, and then he got into the Senate, and then he got into the White House, and he didn't deserve it, and he's black, which makes it even more offensive to these folks and their narrative. And he's married and they seem happy and they have kids and they have a puppy, and like everything about this picture feels unfair because like we're all waiting our turn, you don't get to jump the line. And there's some, and like even if your life is miserable, you're playing by the rules of the American dream, which is like one generation I'll get a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher. And so and then the worst offense that Obama committed was he would come down from the top and talk to people and smile at them and actually engage them and shake their hands. And he seemed like he legitimately cared about them, which made it even worse because you're my enemy. Why are you pretending to care about me? And then the EPA, like wanting to make regulations that are going to keep me safe. I don't need you to keep me safe. I keep myself safe. I'm climbing the mountain myself. And so reading her, I realized that the power of a narrative, whether it's a religious narrative or a political narrative, to drive a force. And the brilliance of the Make America Great Again, whether it's Reagan saying it or Trump, is that it forces the memory of something that didn't exist. So, like, it was great and we can get back, but that's a story that makes sense to people. And you write about all these stories that Reagan essentially made up about communism, about welfare mothers, about like all kinds. I mean, I marked some of them, and it's because it's so fascinating. Reagan spread the worldview. The Soviet Union was not a geopolitical rival, but an evil empire. International crises were not diplomatic problems, but confrontations with godless communism. Single mothers on welfare were not victims of an unfair system, but frauds and freeloaders who refused to work. And like, this is a story that he's telling. And I felt for many years that we lack a competing narrative until the moment that Michelle Obama said that the White House was a house that was built by enslaved people and now occupied by the descendants of enslaved people. And all of a sudden, America got back a narrative, like the other half of America, that this could be a redemption story, that the story that's powerful enough to counter their fantasy of return to some greater time when men weren't bothered by women, and certainly not by non-binary and trans people, and white people weren't bothered by black people and Latinos, and like Christians weren't bothered by. So instead of that, we can't just counter it with Carter's, we need to do better, but we have to counter it with like redemption and joy and inclusion and unity, like not unity, like all the ships rise, right? Like we can create an environment in which everybody's able to flourish. And that feels like an urgent call of our time, just given how compelling and how addictive that other story is.
Exactly. And whether you call it a narrative or religious imaginary, it's that belief that gives you hope that something else is possible. And I heard glimpses of that at the DNC when Michelle Obama spoke. I had heard glimpses of it when Kamala first announced that she would run, and you had, white mothers for Kamala and white dudes and black women and all those people are looking for a new story and a new imaginary. And when she talks about joy, that is the beginning of it. I think someone, or many of us, have to work with her to spin out that story, because very few people can do it on their own. I think FDR was an amazing communicator, as was Reagan. Hopefully, maybe Kamala can do it, but you're right. That's what we need. We need a new narrative that gives us hope, because I think it was Ralph Reed, the conservative organizer, said people respond to hope or to fear. And we're going to go with fear. And he said that maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it's only become more intense among the religious right and the conservative right since then. I mean, Trump is now like, the avatar of fear.
Right.
And Kamala is talking about joy. And that is what we need to hear.
Right, American carnage.
Yeah.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about the paradox of the American dream? Because I agree that hope obviously is so essential to our spiritual well-being and to our political movements. And then there's something about the American dream that I think induces despair and rage among people, because there's a growing awareness that American dream is not accessible to so many people. and either the dream needs to be restated or reworked, I mean, it's confusing because we need the dream, and the dream is what shows us how far we are from achieving what we yearn for as human beings. And so, how do you see that playing out? That like sort of tension or paradox of having something that we're really that we're yearning for.
It works on multiple levels, and one level is the concentration of wealth in a few hands in this country. And the reason things are not accessible is because there are multi-millionaires who don't think they have enough money and won't think they have enough money till they impoverish all of us. And it's amazing. I think until we agree to a new kind of taxation on extreme wealth, part of the American dream isn't going to be available to many of us because more and more people are going to be losing their jobs. That's a very practical approach, but I also think we need people among us to be telling stories and to be offering new narratives. I think we need a new kind of journalism that is not, that reminds us that hope and change and a different kind of way of being is possible. If you've noticed, one of my favorite philosophers is Noam Chomsky. I don't, well, maybe I've seen him quoted once in the mainstream news. He is not ever in the mainstream news because the mainstream news decides that, no, he's outside the circle of common sense, or he's outside the circle of the status quo. And so we just won't quote someone like that. And until we enlarge who we talk to and who we listen to, alternate ideas will never be present to us. And that's another problem. So people forget the news is corporately owned, and corporations like the status quo. So we are in a double fix because we don't hear certain people and we only hear certain things. I am daily fighting with my urge to cancel my New York Times subscription because in the book I talk about the media slavishly reporting Reagan and not being critical about what he was saying. In a way, it's even worse with Trump. They quote bits and pieces of what he says as if it's coherent without really questioning his capacity for leadership given his mental state at present. And the fact that they can get away with that is mind-boggling to me. And it's not just the New York Times, it's most of our newspapers, which is why I tell my journalism students that I hope they have enough money to start their own newsletter, because you're not going to get what you need just through the mainstream media.
This is another paradox. I mean, the media landscape looks dramatically different now than it did 50 years ago. Or 40 years ago, when Reagan was in the midst of this kind of transformation, and you talk about what the country was like when everyone had the same three news sources: ABC, NBC, CBS, essentially, versus now when like any idiot can have millions of followers and get to so many and say things that are completely not true and that are false, that are harmful, that are demeaning. Not even to speak about AI and like these fake videos and fake reporting. So, I mean, that is also a double-edged sword. The democratization became such a radical democratization that in a way, every voice is equal, and even some of the more sophisticated voices are kind of lower on the media hierarchy in terms of, like on the food chain, in terms of what people are actually accessing and hearing. So how do we navigate that responsibly?
If I knew the answer to that, I would be dean of my school.
You're chair of the department, so
no. Lots of people look back to the 60s and 70s when we had more concentrated media and say, wow, that was great, that was a heyday. Well, not really, because most of the people who were writing were straight white men whose point of view became authoritative. So that wasn't the greatest thing ever either. And it was nice that we had a more consistent understanding of what was happening in the world because we all were getting news from the same sources. But it wasn't as if we had an omniscient or a perspective on things. So in a way, neither that paradigm nor the current one is great. And I have sad news that it's only going to get worse, because I think more and more of the mainstream media is going to be dead, and more influencers are going to be the way people get their news. I myself am grateful for all the people on Substack who I think I can trust. And I think places like that where you can find voices that pass your test of kosher are going to be the way more and more of us get news.
It's one of the things, we're going to go to questions in a second, but that's one of the things I hope you'll address for us before we finish, which is what media do you consume, and what do you feel is responsible media as we're tracking this especially contentious political season. But I just want to ask, I want to kind of go back to something that you said, which is, in a way, you kind of put the blame, some of the blame on media for reporting Reagan the way that they did and elevating his ideas, and today to our media ecosystem for elevating Trump's ideas. And I wonder what responsible media should do about these folks who, what is the responsibility of media in the face of a very powerful person who's saying things that are either patently untrue or deeply problematic? I mean, even I remember I just did what the media did, which is they couldn't say that Trump was lying for like years. They would say it is untrue, or it seems unprovable, or whatever, and they couldn't just say Trump lied today when he said that his inauguration was the biggest in history. So I've ingested that. So what do you think is actually the responsible way for media to respond to really these very egregious new lows that we seem to be hitting every day, without actually elevating the very ideas that this person is putting into the ether?
Well, with Trump, I think reporting what he actually says would be enough. I mean, we get snippets that seem to be cohesive, but we don't hear, the whole quote, which is like nonsense. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really easy one to remedy. I also think by trying to play both sides equally, the media made such a big deal about Biden's age and his mental competency. I've seen very few stories which do the same thing with Trump. So just trying to be even-handed with these very basic issues might be a good start.
And I think it's precisely their attempt to be even-handed that's making it not fair in
Right.
some ways, because they're like, well, we don't want to seem like we're
Right.
going against Trump, so we won't report just
Right.
how
Crazy
incomprehensible things are. Yes.
Yeah.
I would love to hear what's on your mind. What questions do you have? And Len, I'm going to call on you first, but we have just 10 minutes, so we'll keep the questions short, and introduce yourselves first as you start.
My name is Len Miroff. I used to be a proud graduate of a school in New York City. And back then, in the 81, I had a button that said, the moral majority is neither. And I think that MAGA is a descendant of that. And if we could have a similar wordplay to help disavow them of that sense that they really are the ones who are carrying the flag for what our country should stand for. Because I wore that button proudly.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of telling a story, which is what we need to do more of. Think of ways to tell that story, to put it on buttons, to share it among ourselves.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Eric Green. Hi, Diane. I'm curious if you can talk about the role of masculinity and the role of whiteness in the rise of Ronald Reagan, and what difference that made in creating the conditions where he could come to power.
That is a great question, and I address it in the book, and I'll try to do it quickly here. The 70s, with the rise of the women's movement, with the Black Panthers, with all the groups that were previously marginalized that began to have a sense of who they were, was a very threatening time for white men in particular. This was compounded, and for their status, for the sense of their status, and it was compounded because of the economic troubles we were going through, and the fact that many of those same white men were losing their jobs. So we talk about a crisis of white masculinity now, and how so many white men, especially younger ones, are turning to Trump for reassurance because he seems powerful. Something very similar was happening back then. And Reagan projected the image of a strong, tough man. A lot of the campaign shots were at the ranch and he's on a horse, or he's making a fire, or he's doing something to show his, white man strength. And he did have that Hollywood, aura around him. So part of Reagan's attraction was that very whiteness. He was a very shifty player in many ways, because as you probably know, he gave one of his early speeches in the Neshoba County Fair, which was very close to the site of the murders of 3 civil rights activists. When he was criticized for it, he said, well, the following week I went up to New Jersey or up north and spoke to a black gathering. But he had a certain code that people who wanted to hear could hear it that was racist.
He talked about states' rights in that speech.
Right, he did exactly talk about states' rights. Thank you for reminding me. And when he began speaking about welfare queens and young bucks, I have a book about how he racialized and gendered poverty. And there was a lot, there were then, and there probably are now, many more white people on welfare than people of color. But Reagan made it seem like this was a problem for single black mothers. So he really played into this sense of white grievance, and white male grievance in particular. So Reagan did that, and Trump does it like not even subtly. He's quite overt about it. So yes, I think a lot of what we see is a crisis of white masculinity, and I think that's part of what has triggered the growth of white Christian nationalism, because we haven't talked much about this, but Trump has made white Christian nationalism, which has been a thing since the 20th, probably since the founding of the country, but he's given it a legitimacy that it never had before. So.
I see. Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Joe Schwartz. I was thinking about the MAGA movement and its success. Obviously, they say make America great again, to harken back to a fictional time that America was great, that somehow they had fallen from. Do you think to some extent that that is influenced by the fact that for most people it was that, not so much that America was great, but that it seemed great because they were young, they had a lot more time to do whatever they wanted to do in life. Life was a lot less complicated because they were either young or they were children. My wife and I were talking about this the other day, and it seemed like, yeah, wasn't life simpler and great and more fun because we were younger and we had less responsibility? And do you feel like to some extent that is kind of how MAGA gets to succeed, or that helps fuel it?
I think that's part of it, but I think it also goes back to what Eric was pointing to. The people who want to make America great again want to make it great for white men in particular. So I think for many people who maybe are not quite of that mindset, they're thinking of a happier, easier time. But for a lot of other people, it's hitting them at a different level where they, want the power they once and the status they once had.
Hi, my name is Brittany. I was lucky to be exposed to Howard Zinn and Outfox when I was in high school, while also being equally exposed to very extreme black conservatism that's very detrimental to the black community. I believe that education is the counterpoint, and that misinformation is child abuse. But what is the feasibility of getting media literacy classes in those populations that are underrepresented that will be voting?
Well, you know, one of my conspiracy theories is that the Republicans have been trying for the last 60 years to gut American education. So it's not just media literacy, it's everything. And it's no surprise that Trump has said, or maybe it's Project 2025 has said, that they pretty much want to get rid of the Department of Education. So, yes, media literacy is crucial, but I think media literacy comes after regular literacy. And I am always surprised when I see students who cannot write clear sentences, because I think writing is a guide to thinking. And if your thinking is ordered, your writing to some extent will be ordered. So I think media literacy is a big problem, but I think the state of American education is the bigger concern right now.
Bob Wolf, one of the keys, I think, and you sort of touched on this at the beginning, to Reagan's effectiveness was his geniality. He had a famous relationship with Tip O'Neill. Just kind of remember the two of them, Democrat and Republican, sitting together, laughing and smiling. Reagan could be self-deprecating, which I thought was also a part of his effectiveness. So those have totally disappeared, and you touched on this with the political as tools of effectiveness, and where we've just gone in the total opposite direction. And I wonder if you have any thoughts of why that died away as an effective means of salesmanship since Reagan's time. I can't imagine Reagan having a Trump-like demeanor and being effective. That was just not what he was about, with this twinkle in his eye and calling his wife mommy. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
The rise of Republican political, what do you call the people behind the scenes? Operatives, yeah. In the 90s, and Newt Gingrich as well, I think changed the Republican mindset from working across the aisle and being convivial and we're all in this together, to more of like, let's just not work with them at all. And maybe the less we work with them, the more we'll build our base. So it's one of the things I haven't blamed Reagan for, though maybe I'll rethink it. But it seems that a very nasty strain made its way into Republican politics after Reagan that thought incivility would be a more effective tool for governance and civility.
Okay, we're going to close momentarily. So Leanna, Wendy, and Sean, quick questions, and then we'll wrap.
Quick. About Reagan. One of the big things that I think of quite often is the fact that Reagan basically closed mental health. And when I look at the amount of homeless people that we have, over 50% of them are homeless because of mental illness not being able to be treated. And that is extremely scary to me, the ramifications of the kinds of policies that, and I think when we talk about Trump, he's mentally ill. And I wonder how much of that, if we had kept those institutions in place, maybe we wouldn't have.
Do you want to hear all three questions and then respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
My name is Leanna, and I'm an evangelical, or that's how I identify, and I should use this time quickly to atone because I did vote for Reagan in my first election, so I'm sorry, but I didn't even know you could be a Christian and be a Democrat when I was raised. But I just wanted to share something from the belly of the beast. I just had lunch with my sisters who are both voting for Trump, and I was like, they had mentioned that the church I grew up in a mega church, has removed the name evangelical from the title, and everybody agreed that it's become a bad word. And I'm like, maybe things have changed. Maybe things are opening up. Maybe this is, and I was like, Joy, can you just explain to me, like, how have evangelicals gotten behind Trump? As Christians, like, I don't understand, because in the 80s it was moral majority, and it was like, all right, they have some, family, focus on the family and everything. So I was like, I don't understand it. And she's like, well, I'm not voting for pastor in chief. I really like his policies. And I was like what? Like, what are your policies? What are the evangelicals getting behind? And she says, well, like law and order. So of course I'm like, well, and we talk about this, and she's like, Leanna, I had friends that were singing praise songs on January 6th. And they were walking peacefully. It's the People's House. And they were walking peacefully through the halls of Congress. And she's like, I don't like him. So I just want to also make sure people understand that not every evangelical, like, loves Trump, like, is like, I know there's a lot of them that are like, it's the cult of personality. But my sisters, anyway, are both voting for him because they believe his policies and this concept of being liberty and justice and whatever. And anyway, that was one thing I want to share. And I can't remember the other thing, but it was just very shocking when there are people that are intelligent and they are educated. I was raised in a very fear of education. Like, my grandparents were like so depressed when I got into UCLA. You know what I mean? They were like, she wanted me to go to Bible school. So like there was an oh, I knew what I was going to say. So how do you deal with people when they believe a totally different reality? Like, they watched the Tucker Carlson documentary about January 6th, and they really believe it. And there's nothing, I don't know how to deal with that.
I don't mean to suggest all evangelicals are conservative Christians, because there's not, and there are many conservative evangelicals who don't like Trump and what the evangelical church has come to be. And if you read David French in the New York Times, he's one of the leaders of that group. There's an organization called After the Party of evangelicals who believe that the church has gone astray by putting political earthly power above one's relationship to God. So, yes, evangelicals shouldn't get a terrible name. As far as being able to change people, I am always heartened by those stories, and they're usually a Jewish rabbi who meets someone from the Ku Klux Klan and befriends them. And remember the New Yorker story? And there was one of those stories from another church that was in the South.
Westboro.
Yeah, the Westboro.
Yeah.
So I do think it's possible to change people, but it's a slow process. It's a slow process. So I don't think we're going to change the minds of most people who support Trump. But if we can peel away a few who shouldn't be supporting him, and I'm thinking of like those crazy rich business people who are just wanting to have their taxes lowered. Yeah, those people are the people who really drive me crazy.
Okay, we're going to hear just one last question, a quick one from Sean, and then we'll close.
Two things. Here's my question.
5 quick
Two words: Lee Atwater. Just Lee Atwater came up. Dick Cheney's endorsement yesterday is indicative of something. My question, actually, the pressure of the closing question. Throughout, you both have alluded to things that go back to the origins of American history, right? I hear the strains of Know Nothing. I hear the strains of a long conversation about race, right? The agricultural conflicts in the early republic. Rabbi Brous talked about the image of the Jesus as the businessman, which obviously goes back to, as you said, Diane, right, the late 19th century. Can you tell us in this moment, what are the pieces that are truly sort of part and parcel, you started on this, of the pendulum of American history, that this is in our DNA, we're always going to be fighting these fights, and then what about the current moment is genuinely new that is really different from that constant back and forth?
I believe that being a secular nation that has a deep need to believe in a higher power and to see ourselves as an exceptional people, we are always going to be going back and forth about what does it mean to be one people out of many. And it does take the communitarian version, and it does take the individualistic version. I think what's new about today is who we are looking to as leaders. The fact that the standard for the hopefully communitarian version is a woman of color is very new, because she would not have been counted as a person in the founders' eyes. Women and people of color were not American citizens. So I would hope the founders would be happy at the progressive revelation of our history, our American history, because I believe it is a progressive revelation and it's not stuck in time. And power should be given to more than white male landowners. So I think it's an amazingly smart question, Sean, and I see hope in the fact that we are looking at someone hopefully to lead us who we could not have imagined doing so 20 years ago, 10 years ago, no less hundreds of years ago.
Thank you, Diane. I want to just say, if folks started at the beginning of the Parsha when we were reading today, you need look no further than Parshat Shoftim to see the absolute terror of a leader who's not focused on building and strengthening the people, but is focused on profiting off of the people. And so I really so deeply appreciate this analysis. It's called Writing the American Dream, RIGHT, Writing the American Dream. And Diane, thank you for this, and thank you for bringing it here to our community. I hope this is an ongoing conversation, and wish you all a sweet and restful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, everybody.